Snow fell like breath held too long, soft, uncertain, and heavy with silence. The valley, nestled deep between sleeping pine-covered hills, didn't stir at dawn. It hadn't for years. It was a place of quiet resignation where things were either endured or buried. Caleb Martin stepped onto the frostbitten porch of his worn-out cabin with his hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of another unanswered prayer. His boots crunched over thin ice as he moved to his old truck, pausing to adjust the blue knit scarf around his neck. Ellie had made it from leftover yarn last winter. It didn't match anything he owned, but he wore it like armor. She was still asleep, her breathing shallow and dry, muffled behind the quilt door he'd fashioned to keep the heat in. Every winter took something. This year he feared it might be her breath. He poured black coffee into a dented thermos and tied a folded napkin around it with twine. Inside the napkin was a note. "Lunch at 12. I'll be home by dusk. Breathe easy today, baby." He placed it beside her favorite mug on the windowsill, knowing she'd see it the moment she woke up. The engine groaned to life like an old man rising from prayer. He didn't look back as he drove through the veil of snowfall, past the thin fence he could no longer afford to mend, down the gravel road lined with ghosts, each one shaped like a memory of what this valley used to be. At the general store, he waited. Not for goods, but for a chance. The valley didn't give many of those. He leaned against the outer wall, watching men with thicker coats and fuller bellies pass him by. A few nodded. Most didn't. They all had their own weight to carry. It was old Harold Jennings who finally approached, his gloved hands stuffed into his coat like something urgent needed keeping. "There's someone up on the ridge," Harold said. "Needs help. Wood. Repairs, maybe. She's alone." Caleb nodded. "Pay?" Harold shrugged. "Didn't ask, but she's got it." "She?" "Widow. Maeve Alden." The name pressed cold against Caleb's ribs. The woman who hadn't left her property. In over a decade, people whispered about her. Said she still owned half the valley, though she let it rot. They said she'd gone mad after losing her son. Others said she'd just gone still. Stillness didn't scare Caleb. He drove. The road to the ridge narrowed to a breath, winding like memory between frost-stiff trees. The snow was deeper here, untouched, as if even weather was careful not to disturb her. Her house appeared all at once. Dark shingles, wide porch, windows shuttered tight. It looked abandoned if not for the slow drift of chimney smoke, curling like ink against the pale morning. He parked, stepped out, and waited. It felt wrong to knock, like knocking on a grave. But the door creaked open before he could raise his hand. She stood in the frame, wrapped in a black wool shawl that hung like shadow. Her hair was silver, not gray, but silver, clean and defiant, and her eyes were unreadable, as if they didn't look at him but through him. "Caleb Martin," she said. Not a question. He nodded once. "You're late." He wasn't. She turned, walked back inside and left the door open. He followed. Inside smelled of pine smoke and old books. Everything was made of wood, but nothing felt warm. The walls were hung with empty frames and one mirror that had been turned to face the wall. No clocks, no noise except the steady snap of the fire. She didn't offer coffee or conversation. Outside, the woodpile waited. It had sunk beneath the snow, hunched like an old animal. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Each swing of the axe was measured, not by strength, but by memory. He used to chop like this with Ellie's mother watching from the kitchen window, laughing when he missed and pretending not to see the blisters. Now, the silence only answered with its own kind. From the corner of his eye, he saw the curtain shift. She was watching, not judgmental, not curious, just present. Hours passed in fragments, snowflakes caught in his beard. The sky went colorless. His back ached and his gloves wore thin, but the pile began to shrink. He looked up only when the creak of the door announced her return. She held a mug of tea. Steam curled like breath. He reached for it, but she didn't hand it to him. She set it on the porch railing between them. "Tomorrow," she said, turning to leave. He stared at the mug, took a sip. Bitter, herbal, strange, but warm. Back home, Ellie was waiting by the window. She smiled when she saw the scarf still around his neck. "You came back," she whispered, her voice worn and paper-thin. He sat beside her, placing his hand gently on her back, counting each breath she took like they were coins in a dwindling jar. "Met the widow," he said. She blinked. "Is she mean?" He considered. "No, she's just quiet." Ellie handed him a drawing, a crooked tree with a swing, roots stretching like hands beneath the dirt. "Give her this," she said. "So, she's not so quiet anymore." He kissed the top of her head. "I will." The next morning, Caleb left the drawing at the widow's door. Said nothing, just leaned it there like a secret waiting to be heard. She didn't mention it. But the next day, there was a scarf draped over the porch railing. Gray wool, hand-stitched, thick and warm. He didn't ask if it was for him. He just wore it. They didn't speak often, but they spoke in gestures. He fixed her barn door. She left a lantern lit when the nights got darker. He salted her steps. She began leaving a second mug. Inside her house, untouched rooms began to breathe again. He noticed fresh logs near the hearth, dried flowers set on windowsills. One evening, he saw her standing outside beneath the stars, looking up with her, arms at her sides, not praying, not grieving, just remembering. He watched from the truck, engine idling, not wanting to break the spell. That night, Ellie coughed in her sleep. It was deep, tearing, and endless. He held her, whispering stories until dawn cracked over the trees. Stories about when her mother laughed too hard and burned the stew. About the way the river smelled in spring. About the day she was born and... The wind outside had gone completely still. In the morning, he chopped more wood. This time she opened the door and handed him a letter, sealed with wax. "For your girl," Maeve said. Then she went back inside. The envelope smelled faintly of lavender. Inside, a pressed violet and a note in neat handwriting. "For the child who still draws trees in winter. You remind the dead to keep listening." Ellie pressed it to her heart like a promise. That night, Caleb stared at the fire for hours. He didn't believe in miracles. He believed in small things done quietly, in hands that kept moving, in letters, in cups of tea, and maybe, just maybe, in people who didn't need to be saved, but offered a place to rest for those who did. The snow fell thicker that evening, but the fire burned warmer, and when he returned to the ridge the next morning, the window curtain didn't shift. Instead, the door was open, and the scarf she'd given him hung over the chair by the fire, still warm from the night before. The house was quieter than usual. When Caleb stepped through the widow's door that morning, the scent of pine and smoke had thinned, replaced by a faint trace of lavender and something older, dust, perhaps, or memory. The hearth was cold. The tea mugs hadn't moved. The second chair beside the fire sat empty, its cushion still bearing the shallow imprint of someone who'd once made silence feel like a companion rather than a void. He paused in the entryway, his boots heavy with melting snow. The scarf she'd knitted him hung loose around his neck, still damp from the walk up the ridge. The silence here didn't feel like stillness anymore. It felt like an unanswered question. He called softly, "Maeve?" No reply. Not fear, just a slow, creeping ache. He stepped further in. She wasn't in the kitchen, though the kettle was out, and a single tea bag sat beside it, dry and waiting. A book lay open on the windowsill, a collection of poetry with an old train ticket marking the page. The words underlined in pencil read, "Grief is not a guest. It is the dust and the floorboards." Caleb exhaled and moved toward the back. The door to the room on the left was ajar. Inside, he found her sitting on the edge of a cedar chest, not looking at him but at the far wall, where a faded photograph had been hung without a frame. "I don't need help today," she said, voice low, flat like pond water in winter. He said nothing, but he didn't leave. "I dreamt about him again," she added, her eyes still locked on the photo. "He was wearing that awful sweater with the green patches. I hated it, but he said it made him feel older." Caleb glanced toward the photo. A boy, maybe 17, wind in his hair, barefoot on what looked like this very porch. "He's been gone 10 years, she said, finally turning to look at him. "You'd think dreams would let go." "They don't," Caleb answered. "They just change their shape." She nodded, as if accepting that answer was harder than believing it. They sat in silence, not for minutes, but for something longer, something that wrapped itself around the bones. When Maeve stood, she seemed smaller. Not weak, just unarmored. She reached into the chest and took out a box wrapped in a faded quilt square. "This was his," she said. "He was always carving. Sticks, stones, whatever he could find." She opened the box to reveal a small, hand-carved boat. No sails, no name, just curves shaped by patience. It fit perfectly in her palm. "I thought it would rot," she murmured. "But it's still here, still smooth." Caleb looked down at his own hands, calloused, cracked from wind and axe. "Things built with care usually last," he said. Maeve placed the boat back gently and closed the lid. "Your daughter, Ellie, she keeps drawing trees. She loves them. Says they're like people who remember things." Maeve gave a soft laugh, her first in days. She's right. He hadn't meant to stay long. But when he rose to leave, she followed him out. The snow was falling again, slower now, like it had changed its mind. "She's getting worse, isn't she?" Maeve asked suddenly, as they stood on the porch. Caleb hesitated. "Some days are better. Others, not so much. You can't keep bringing her through this winter on hope alone." "I don't have much else," he said, almost smiling. "Hope's the only thing not rationed." Maeve's hands tightened around the edge of the porch railing. Her voice dropped. "What if I told you there's more than just firewood I need? Help with?" He turned to her. She didn't speak right away. When she did, the words came slowly, as if they'd been waiting too long behind her teeth. "I still own the land beyond the ridge," she said. 20 acres. A greenhouse mostly collapsed. A shed full of tools no one's touched in years, and soil that's still good, under the frost." He listened. "I can't run it," she went on. "I can barely stand some mornings. But someone could, someone who needs it more than I do." Caleb understood what she was offering, but he shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything." "This valley owes your daughter everything," she said quietly. "She reminded me I'm still part of it." Snowflakes clung to the edges of her shawl. The wind held its breath. "I'll help," Caleb said, "but not because I want anything from you." "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm asking." That afternoon, they walked the edge of the ridge together. The trees grew closer there, as if listening. The greenhouse leaned into itself, its roof half-caved, glass spidered with frost. But beneath the ruined frame, life waited. Dry stalks, forgotten seeds, rusted tools buried beneath snow like old promises. They spent the next few days side by side, fixing, clearing, patching the torn places with quiet hands. Maeve didn't move fast, but she moved with purpose. And Caleb noticed that when she bent to scoop soil, her fingers didn't tremble as much. She watched him the way someone watches a candle burn in a cold room, not out of fear it'll go out, but with reverence that it still burns at all, and he, in turn, watched her shed her silences one by one. Back home, Ellie's breathing was still shallow but steadier. Her cheeks held more color, and the night coughs were fewer. He brought her stories of broken greenhouses and secret boats and ladies who used to be ghosts. She smiled through tired eyes and said, "You like her?" "I respect her," Caleb answered. She's kind of like our house, Ellie whispered. Looks lonely from far away. But if you get close, it's warm. The days stretched. Winter tightened its grip, but the greenhouse stood straighter. One afternoon, Maeve handed Caleb a wrapped parcel, tied in twine, smelling faintly of cedar. Inside were old letters, bundled with a ribbon that had faded to gray. He wrote them to me, she said. From school. From the bus station. Even from the edge of that forest where he went missing. I couldn't read them. Not until now. Caleb unfolded one. The handwriting was messy, but full of life. Mom, if you could see this place, you'd cry and then laugh and then cry again. I miss the sound the stairs make when you walk up them. I miss the way you smell like firewood and soap. I miss everything. But I'm okay. Tell the trees I said hello. Maeve pressed a hand to her heart. You should plant something here, Caleb said. Something that lasts. I already have, she said, eyes meeting his. Ellie's drawings, your hands. My son's words. She paused, then added, and you. The wind picked up then, scattering dry leaves over the ridge. As Caleb turned to leave, she called out, would she like it if we built her a swing? She'd love that. When he returned home, Ellie was awake, sitting up on her own. I had a dream, she whispered. There were 2 boats, floating on a frozen river, and someone lit a lantern on one of them. What did it mean? He asked. She smiled faintly. That someone's waiting. He kissed her forehead and tucked the quilt closer. Outside, the stars were beginning to shimmer. And on the windowsill, beside the note he'd left days before, sat a new one, written in Ellie's handwriting. Dear Miss Maeve, thank you for the boat. Thank you for not being scared of the snow. I hope we both get better soon. Let's draw trees together when it's spring. Love, Ellie. And for the first time in weeks, Caleb didn't feel like he was carrying winter alone. The thaw came late that year, slow and stubborn. Ice clung to the roots of the birch trees even as the sun pressed down harder each day. By mid-March, the greenhouse windows began to sweat. Inside, sprouts nudged through the soil like they were tasting the world for the first time. Caleb stood beneath the cracked beams, his sleeves rolled and his hands stained with loam. A row of lettuce had taken shape beside a modest patch of wild thyme, and beneath the far table, Maeve's marigolds had bloomed defiantly, like tiny suns refusing to fade. He paused to wipe his forehead and glanced at the small swing they'd mounted between the 2 apple trees. It creaked softly in the breeze. Ellie had been there that morning, bundled in her coat and scarf, her breath visible in the chill air. She didn't cough as much anymore. Her smile, once faded and thin, had filled back in. Caleb hadn't dared to hope that deeply through the winter, but now he let himself. Maeve entered quietly, holding a cup of broth. Her walk had grown steadier, less of a shuffle, and her cheeks had more color than he remembered seeing, even in autumn. She wore an old scarf twisted around her neck, the color of dried lavender. It had belonged to her son. She never said his name aloud, and Caleb never asked. She liked the swing, Maeve said, offering him the cup. She said it made her feel taller. Maeve smiled. That child will be taller than the mountains one day. Caleb sipped the broth, grateful for the warmth. He studied her face. The lines carved by grief were still there, but no longer dominated her expression. Something lighter had taken root, something cautious but alive. We got word this morning, he said slowly. From the doctor in Fairview. She looked at him sharply. She's responding to the treatment. Better than expected. Her lungs are healing. They think the air here, the dry cold, the elevation, helped. Maeve blinked quickly. That's good, she murmured. More than good, he replied. They say she might be strong enough to go to school again by the end of the summer. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It brimmed with relief, unspoken prayers, and a kind of gratitude that didn't need names. Maeve placed a hand on his arm. She deserves a season with laughter. They stood together, watching a sparrow dance along the rafters. The greenhouse, once a ruin, hummed with breath and roots and green hope. Later that week, Caleb returned to the ridge with a crate of seedlings. Ellie walked beside him, her gait slow but steady. Maeve was already waiting, arranging stones in a half-circle beneath. "The cedar tree. You're early," she said, shielding her eyes from the sun. "We were excited," Ellie said, grinning. They spent the morning planting, radishes, chard, and small flowering beans that curled upward like they knew secrets. Maeve taught Ellie how to mound the dirt properly. Caleb mostly watched, letting the quiet conversations between the two of them unfold like the season itself. At noon, they took their meal under the swing. Maeve had made lentil stew, and Caleb had brought the last of the winter apples. Ellie drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, swirls, suns, and spirals. "This place used to be sad," she said suddenly, her voice soft. "But now it's not." Maeve looked over at her, eyes shining. "It used to be lonely. That's different." Caleb glanced between them and then looked out over the ridge. The valley below shimmered with snowmelt and pine. Somewhere down there, life went on. Trains passed, stores opened, people hurried. But here, time listened. That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep beneath a quilt of patchwork and pine-scented air, Caleb sat by the window, watching the moon etch silver along the frost line. Maeve had stayed late, helping finish the last row of peas. She had left her gloves behind. He turned them over in his hands, worn, frayed at the fingertips. The initials stitched inside were not hers. He remembered the look on her face when Ellie had thanked her for the swing, the stories, the quiet days of planting. Maeve had simply nodded, but Caleb had seen it. The tremble in her jaw, the way her hands clenched the hem of her coat. The next morning, he found her at the far edge of the greenhouse, fixing the trellis. A small radio sat nearby, humming old jazz tunes. She didn't turn when he approached. "You left these," he said, holding out the gloves. She accepted them slowly. They were his. "I thought so." They stood in a silence that wasn't awkward, just full. "I used to think grief was a weight," she said finally. "But it's more like weather. It moves, changes. Some days it rains, some days it clears." Caleb nodded. "And some days it grows things." She smiled, sad and true. Yes, they worked through the morning. By midday, the greenhouse looked like something reborn, its glass patched, its frames straightened, the smell of life thick in the air. Maeve sat on the bench, watching Caleb fix a loose panel on the door. "I've been thinking," she said, after a while, "about the land." He looked up. "I want to leave it to you, not just to use, to own." He froze. "Maeve, I'm not dying," she added quickly. "Not yet, but someday I will. And this place, it should go to someone who'll carry it forward, not lock it away in memory." Caleb walked to her, kneeling slightly so they were eye level. "You're part of our family now. You know that, right?" "I do," she said. "That's why I can give it." He couldn't speak, not then, but his hand found hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment. Over the next few weeks, word spread. People from the neighboring towns began visiting, curious about the greenhouse that had somehow bloomed in the heart of winter. Maeve started offering small bundles of herbs and sprouts in exchange for stories. Ellie made signs for the beds. "Please speak kindly. The plants are listening." One afternoon, an elderly man named Tom brought a box of heirloom seeds. He'd heard of what they were doing and wanted to contribute. A woman from the library offered to help Ellie set up a reading corner beneath the cedar tree. And a boy, maybe 12, asked if he could build a birdhouse to hang from the greenhouse roof. Caleb watched it all unfold, unsure how something that had once felt so impossible had become so simple, so full. Maeve took it all in with quiet wonder. Her grief didn't vanish, but it shifted. Each visitor, each planted seed, carved away at the hollow space until it was something else entirely. a place not of loss, but of remembering and building. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Caleb, Maeve, and Ellie sat on the porch. Fireflies danced in the tall grass, and the swing moved lazily in the wind. "I've never felt like this," Ellie whispered, her voice full of awe. "Like what?" Caleb asked. "Like the world is waiting for me." Maeve reached over and brushed a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. "It is." That night, Caleb dreamed of the greenhouse again. Only this time, it wasn't winter. It was spring. The roof had been fully restored. Children's laughter echoed through the valley, and Maeve's son was standing near the cedar tree, holding one of Ellie's drawings. When he woke, the sky was already light. He rose, walked to the window, and saw Maeve in the distance, standing alone beneath the swing, her shawl billowing in the breeze. He watched her raise her hand, not a wave, but a signal, like a keeper lighting a lantern, and, deep inside, he knew this wasn't an ending. It was the season just before bloom. By the time the first thunderclouds of summer rolled across the valley, Caleb had memorized the way Maeve folded her hands before speaking. Thumb over thumb, quiet as prayer. He'd learned how Ellie now reached for Maeve's sleeve without hesitation, how she'd sometimes braid little wildflowers into the woman's thick silver braid. What he hadn't yet learned was how to ask for what he wanted. The land no longer fought back. The earth, once stubborn and cracked, now parted eagerly beneath their fingers. The greenhouse buzzed with bees, its glass warm to the touch. Every corner breathing green. Tomatoes blushed in sun, vines curled like fingers across the beams, and Caleb could almost forget the lean years behind him. Almost. One morning, he came early. Earlier than usual. The fog still lingered in soft ropes across the ridge, and Maeve was already inside the greenhouse, brushing dew from the basil with a gentleness that felt sacred. She didn't hear him approach, and when he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "I had a dream I stayed here," he said. Maeve turned, pausing only for a breath. And it didn't feel like I was trespassing. She nodded. "Maybe because you weren't." That day passed like honey over warm bread, slow, rich, golden. He fixed a broken section of the fence. Ellie painted a sign that read, "Maeve's Garden," with crooked letters and painted butterflies. Maeve let it hang proudly on the gate, though Caleb noticed she traced the M more than once, eyes distant. But change, like weather, doesn't ask permission. The first sign was the arrival of a black car. It climbed the winding gravel path one evening, headlights slicing through, the pink dusk like knives. Caleb stood from where he was stacking firewood, wiping his hands on his jeans. Maeve was already on the porch, her eyes narrow, lips a thin line. A tall man stepped out in polished shoes that had never seen mud. He carried an envelope and a look of practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Ellery," he said, "I represent the Ridgemont Trust. We're finalizing acquisition of the southern plots. I'm here regarding the parcel your husband sold to our board years ago." Caleb watched Maeve's spine stiffen. "My husband," she said slowly, "sold nothing. He died before that piece was ever considered." The man didn't flinch. "It seems there's confusion in the records, but it's likely just a formality. We'd like you to vacate that portion of land within 30 days. Her silence was so deep, Caleb imagined the very crickets hushed. "Thank you for coming all this way," she said eventually. "You'll be leaving empty-handed." The man gave a tight smile, left the envelope on her porch step, and drove off into the blue of approaching night. That envelope sat untouched for days. It changed things. Maeve became quieter, not cold, but folded inward. Her routine remained unchanged, but something was missing in her eyes, as if part of her had been called away. Caleb watched her, aching to help, but unsure how to reach through years she hadn't yet spoken of. "Did you ever want to leave this place?" he asked her one night, as they stood by the fire pit, embers rising like stars. Maeve didn't answer immediately. "My husband did. Always dreamed of the city, of concrete certainty. I told him it would never love him back. He laughed. died before he could prove me wrong. Caleb said nothing. The silence between them was tender, not empty. A week later, he took Ellie into town for supplies. She picked out lavender soap for Maeve and insisted they buy a blue ribbon for the garden gate. When they returned, Maeve wasn't in the greenhouse. Was by the cedar tree reading a letter. Caleb saw her wipe her eyes before folding the paper shut and slipping it into her pocket. "It was from the trust," she said before he could ask. "They've made an offer. Big one. What'll you do?" Maeve looked up at the valley, every turn of its river, every bend of its trees, engraved into her bones. "Maybe it's time I let go." The words hit like winter air. Cold and sharp. That night. Caleb sat up late in the barn, fiddling with broken tools that didn't need fixing. He thought of what this place had become, not just a refuge, but a rhythm. The quiet of mornings, the scent of time crushed underfoot, Ellie's laugh, Maeve's stillness. He couldn't go back to the man he was before this ridge. By dawn, he'd made a decision. He found her in the greenhouse, brushing soil off her apron. "I've got some money saved," he said, "from the forestry job. It's not much, but maybe enough to help buy that land outright." Maeve turned, eyes tired, soft. "You've done more than enough, Caleb." He stepped closer. "Not for you. For all of us. For what we've built." She looked at him then. Not past him, not through him. At him. "I'm scared it'll all go away," she said. "Like it never existed." He shook his head. "It's already here, in Ellie's hands, in these roots." She stared at him a moment longer before finally resting her forehead against his, a long breath between them. Something real. The days that followed were slow and deliberate. Caleb worked out a modest deal with a neighboring farmer who agreed to co-sign. Maeve, reluctantly but with visible relief, accepted the offer. She didn't want charity. She wanted partnership. Caleb gave her both. They celebrated with a harvest supper under lanterns. Local families came, bringing jars of pickled beets, loaves of sourdough, and songs that cracked through the dark like gentle firecrackers. Ellie danced barefoot. Maeve laughed, a sound like soft bells. And Caleb watched it all, heart full and still. Later, as the stars thickened overhead, Maeve handed him an old envelope. "My husband wrote this when he was dying," she said. "Never read it, until now." Caleb held it carefully. The paper was yellowed, brittle with time. He waited. He said he regretted everything, especially how much he tried to own instead of share. Said if I ever found someone worth trusting again, not to hesitate. Caleb met her eyes. "Did you?" Maeve smiled, slow and real. "I believe I have." The valley didn't change overnight, but something shifted. The greenhouse became a gathering place, a teaching ground. Kids from nearby towns came to learn. Ellie made friends. Maeve began hosting quiet Sunday meals. Caleb built a second swing under the cedar tree. The kind of change that rooted deep and stayed. One afternoon, Maeve stood watching Ellie read beneath the tree, her voice quiet. "You think we get more than one home in this life?" Caleb leaned beside her, brushing soil from his palms. "I think we build them where we're needed." The sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting long amber shadows across the fields. Fireflies blinked into being. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rosemary and old wood. Maeve slid her hand into his. And there, without fanfare, they simply stood. Not seeking answers, not chasing the past, just letting the stillness speak for them.